Hey, I'm Matt, and once a week I break down world building techniques, tricks, and tips, usually by building a world on the fly. This week it's going to be a little different, it's going to be a little shorter. It's because I just got hired as a gig to adapt a very famous sci-fi author's short story into a show, so that's pretty awesome. Couple that with the fact that I have my own book coming out April 6th, shameless plug right there, just goes to show when it rains it pours. So we are going to go real quickly look at imparting information and how the audience deduces information and how we can use these things to get world building information across in 5 different methods. With that in mind, let's get to work. So it's a pretty well-known adage that Hollywood producers don't trust their audiences. This means that they don't really, think they're smart enough to get the information across, which is why a lot of times they embed stuff in the story, or have the villain suddenly explain their motivations, or the hero, that kind of thing. It's not just Hollywood. I've worked pretty much exclusively with Chinese companies for the last 5 years, and it's pretty much the same. Don't trust audiences to figure out the world building details. They are really afraid of it, and this has led to some weird things. Like a lot of times, as working as having done script coverage for a long time, they encourage people to write the character saying like, "I'm doing this for mom," just to themselves in the middle of it, because people are skimming the screenplay and they might not have picked up that's what the character was doing all along. Anyways, all that aside, we're going to trust our audience here, and that goes back to a video I did a few weeks ago about 8 ways that world building's like raising your kid, and one of them is that we teach our kids, we hold their hands, with the expectation that they are going to be able to cross the streets on their own. We teach them to cross the street so that they can cross the street. So we're going to trust our audiences and look at how we can use imparting information and deducing information, soft and hard versions of that, so that the audience can get the world building details, or just character details, any details really, but this is how they get it across. Quick rule of thumb: impart means to tell the audience, deduct means to show the audience. This is show don't tell, as we mentioned before in info dump equity, is an old screenwriting / playwriting thing, and we actually use both of them. Both of them are a tool. When it comes to hard and soft, hard just means more of, and soft means lesser than. So we have this nice little continuum, because everything I do is on a continuum, with a hard impart all the way to hard deduction, and this nice little fun one in the middle called the hybrid. That'll be the last one we get to, since it means that you need to know both hard and soft impart and deduction so that you can use both of them. The hard impart is literally telling your audience. This is Tolkien in his opening of Lord of the Rings and Hobbit, spending 2 chapters on a treatise of what hobbits are and telling you everything about them. This could also be a first-person POV, as in Hunger Games, when you're getting everything through Katniss's POV, which I hope is the case. It's been 10 years since I read that. You can also do a tight third POV, which is point of view, where the audience is privy to all the things in the character's head. This is how the author gets all the information across to the audience, by telling you things. As I mentioned, Lord of the Rings starts off with its 2 chapters, but if you look at even the film version of it, it starts with a hard impart with Gadriel, or whatever her name is, telling you the history of the ring and everything up into that moment, where it went, all these things that are going to become important later. This is an old screenwriting rule, in that if you are going to have a prologue, you do it before the action starts, and people swallow it whole for some reason. Star Wars uses it in that very famous title crawl, with it explains everything about the world itself. Airbender, which is another one of my exemplars when it comes to world building, has earth, wind, fire, and explains it all in like 10 seconds. Pretty impressive. All right, but one thing to remember with this, when you're telling the audience, when you're imparting and hard imparting, is that you must trust the author as the narrator. This could be a little different. It's a first-person POV, but if the narrator is telling you stuff as fact, you have to believe it. Like if they tell you this is a very tall mountain, and then like, oh, it was a short mountain, it was a small mountain, then it's just going to feel like inconsistent detail. And as we know, internal inconsistencies within the story is one of the things that audiences hate the most and breaks the immersion process. The soft impart is like the hard impart, is in the author is telling them something, but it uses characters to impart this information. The protagonist sort of becomes a proxy for the author to feed the audience details without them realizing they're being fed the details. This is often used in info dump equity, which we discussed earlier, where you sit them down and explain the rules of the world. If you just heard Hermione tell you, just like pop up in your head and say like, Harry, this is such and such, this is the perfect example of the soft impart, where again, sat down, told the rules of the world, usually because the main character is ignorant. The farm boy with a sword is partially a trope just because, it's awesome, but also because it means that the character is ignorant. And the ignorance of the protagonist is really, really, really important for the soft impart because it makes it easier for them to tell you stuff. This is part of the 3-act structure, which we discussed a little bit in Infodunk Equity. The second act always begins where the main character is thrown out of their comfortable world and starts a new world and this strange new land. So it makes sense that they need to make sense of it, which is why the mentor character usually shows up to explain the rules itself. As we saw in the Matrix, this is when Neo is finally out of the Matrix and Morpheus sits him down and says, this is the rules of the Matrix, these are all the things that we do. Harry Potter, great example, and is literally sent to school to learn the rules of the world itself, where you have Hermione who's telling him all the magical rules all the time, reminding him, and Ron is also explaining things to the time. So he has 2 mentors explaining the rules of the world. Aang in Last Airbender has Sokka and Katara who are telling him how to things, plus a whole bunch of teachers, each one explaining how this specific bending works. So yeah, Luke, Obi-Wan, Yoda, etc., Frodo, he had Gandalf, Aragorn, and even Gollum works as a mentor as he explains the new world. Game of Thrones, again, we throw the Starks out of their comfort zone. They have to go to King's Landing where they're explained all the rules and court procedure. Daenerys, same thing, she's out of her comfort zone and people are telling her, it is known, Khaleesi, it is known. Same thing with Jon Snow up above the wall where he keeps being told, you know nothing, Jon Snow, as they're explaining the rules to the world. The soft impart is really, really useful and is weaponized all the time, so pay attention to see how you can use it yourself. The soft deduct is kind of the mirror image of the soft impart in that the audience now has to figure things out. It's not told to them through either the narrator or a character explaining it to them. They have to figure it out themselves. A soft deduction is usually a short-term thing where the characters take action and the audience infers their motivation and the rules from their action itself. For instance, if we had a bunch of characters and one of them, standing around, and one of them has a cross and it pops out, another one and they attack him, you're going to infer, well, that was a vampire because, crosses, vampires, all that sort of stuff. I think one of the best examples I remember from science fiction fantasy is from the pilot episode of Firefly, where Shepherd Book has trades passage for a single strawberry, and you see Kaylee's reaction to the strawberry. Nothing really said about that. It's just we know that her reaction means that strawberries are important. Food isn't that important. Scarcity, all this matters. It's a great world building detail that was just not subtly thrown in, but thrown in, and we can, the audience can infer from the character actions how important food is and real food instead of synthetic food. Hard deduct is the furthest out on the spectrum and is where the audience infers the rules to the world based on details without anyone explaining it or the characters taking action. It is just stuff that is there, details, audience pieces it all together. In my book, I mentioned about if it was left-handed elves, if I wanted to get this detail across, I would mention how they all have their scabbards on their right-handed side so that they could draw it with their left hand. That kind of thing. Their buildings would be built this way, that kind of thing. So you pepper the details throughout and the audience eventually just figures it out. The best example of this in fantasy was probably Goon's Wizard of Earthsea. She wanted to write a character that was a person of color, but knew there was no way that was going to fly in the time period in the science fiction and fantasy domain. So what she did was she peppered details throughout about every other character in there having dark skin, and then never mentioned Sparrowhawk's skin color so that the audience would infer that he was of color, was a person of color as well. Now, this is kind of famous because even the covers of it depicted him as a white male, and she wrote about how she kind of found that funny, but she did intentionally use a hard deduction and leave all those details for the audience to figure out, even if the cover artists and publishers might have willfully ignored that. The hybrid is a mix of the imparting of information and deduction, and the idea is that they work at kind of cross purposes. Well, I guess they really work together. The idea is that you've told the audience one thing, but as they experience the world, they realize what has been told them is incorrect, and by piecing the details together through soft deduction or hard deduction, realize that the POV feeding them information is incorrect. This could be a soft impart where the mentor has been explaining things to them the whole time, and you realize that this mentor is an untrustworthy individual and that the rules were not exactly that by experiencing the details for real. It could also be that the character's perception of the tight where the POV, usually a first-person POV, is an untrustworthy narrator. I've never finished it, but I think Prince of Thorns does this. Tell me in the comments if I'm wrong, I probably am. In movies, Fight Club is a great example where you realize that this really, really tight POV where he's actually narrating things, you're hearing his inner monologue, is wrong. Spoiler alert, by the way, 20-something-year-old movie. But once you realize that the POV is untrustworthy, the film has lots of new nuance, and you have to view it in a new light. The Prestige as a film is a great one of that, where you actually have multiple POVs that are feeding you, untrustworthy information, and then once you experience it and the reveal happens, again, 20-year-old movie, spoilers, you look at it and say, oh, like every new detail that I see upon a second viewing has new nuance. I've watched that movie or read the screenplay probably 15 times, and even 2 years ago when I watched it last, I saw a new detail that I missed but all made sense and gave an extra nuance to the story because the untrustworthy narrators, it just made it a little better. Highly recommend it if you haven't seen it, by the way. It's one of my top 5 movies. So there you go. We've got imparting information, deducting information, and the hybrid that's jamming them all together. These are great ways to get information across to your audience, world building, even character details, any detail really. And I hope you can use them to build some better worlds.